Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking all about spotting blacks. What is black spotting? Good question. Well, a good way to tell you what spotting blacks is to perhaps tell you what it's not. So a lot of times when I'm looking at the work of an artist who is still working on their fundamentals and trying to develop their skills as a comic artist and an illustrator, one of the things that I notice more often than not is the lack of any strong shadows or use of black on a page. It's understanding too, because it's really scary to take your beautiful line art and then all of a sudden throw a bunch of black ink and put a stark shadow across a character's face, or completely put one side of their whole body in shadow, or black out a background or something like that. I totally get it. But a lot of times we're so focused on making sure the proportions are right, making sure our use of perspective is correct, making sure our storytelling techniques are working, that it's easy to overlook maybe what can be considered that last layer of finish. And I think ultimately when you look at really strong comic art and illustration, oftentimes that work really conveys a very strong sense of how to utilize black and white on a page. And this is beneficial whether the art is ultimately going to be colored or not. I think colored comic art and illustration only looks better when the foundation, which is the black and white art, is really strong underneath. So if the artwork really has to rely on the color in order to describe the time of day, or the focus of the composition, or the overall mood and tone of the story, then I think ultimately that art is really lacking. I love artist editions. I've even made a few videos on this channel showing you some of my artist editions. And one of the reasons that I love artist editions is because it really shows the foundational artwork before any of the design elements come into play or the color comes into play. And when you look at that stuff, one of the things you'll notice is that nothing is missing. You can read David Mazzucchelli's Daredevil Born Again in black and white in the artist edition version, and you're not going to be wondering whether that's a snow scene or whether that's a day scene or a night scene. Everything is there. The color ultimately is there just to enhance the work. And so I'm very much inspired by artists like David Mazzucchelli and Will Eisner and Alex Toth. These artists really utilize the full range of black and white in their pieces. It's also not to say that there's only one way of doing this. I, of course, have my influences and my preferences when it comes to aesthetics, but there's more than one way to go about this. In fact, there's a whole Franco-Belgian European style that revolves around this clean line concept, which is very much the opposite of my style and a lot of my influence. And I love that stuff. It was really pioneered by Hergé with the Tintin comic. And you'll see this style throughout a variety of European comic artists, Mobius being one of them. And when you look at those artists, you certainly don't feel like there's anything lacking just because there's less black on the page. Stylistically, they just choose to go for a different look and a different feel. And although that European clean line art style very much utilizes color when creating their worlds and atmospheres, if you ever look at the black and white versions of some of those pages, they're just as clear and just as descriptive. But I think all of those works can be published in black and white and still be just as effective and interesting. One of the things that I try to avoid with my art, and I also offer to other artists that are just starting out, is to not make the piece ultimately look like it's a coloring book page. There's a difference between a coloring book page and a piece of finished comic art and illustration. And the biggest difference is that coloring book page is essentially unfinished. It's screaming to be enhanced and built upon. It really needs the color in order to be complete. Whereas even a piece of black and white comic art and illustration that is ultimately going to get colored, it doesn't need that color in order to feel finished or complete. It can exist on its own, independent of any color, and still make just as much sense and feel just as complete. In fact, I think most artists prefer seeing the black and white, more raw version. Hence the popularity of the artist editions. Which, by the way, side note, if you really want to get a crash course in learning how to make comic art, get yourself an artist edition. It can be a big investment. Some of the more expensive ones are upwards of 150 and 200 bucks, but it's a really smart and I think beneficial investment if you really want to see how the sausage is made. And also, if you don't want to spend that money, there's something called an Artisan Edition that IDW puts out. They put out most of the artist editions as well, and then usually like a year or two later, they make a trade paperback soft cover version, and it's like 25 bucks. And it's the same thing, it's just not the same actual size as an artist edition. So it's smaller, so you don't get the full scope of the actual real size of the original art, but you're still seeing everything else, and it's a fraction of the price. So check those out. I'll link a couple of the ones that I have below. Anyway, in the last video, I was working on this particular commission, and I left off where it was just the ink line work. And I posed it to you if you wanted to see the completion of the inking process, including how I go about spotting blacks. And it was a positive response in that direction, so here we go. The stage in which I ended that last video at is oftentimes the stage that I'm talking about where a lot of artists in the beginning kind of just stop. The line art is there. It's easy to get real attached to that line art and not want to mess it up. But personally, I feel like something's missing. I feel like I could take this piece much further by adding more dramatic shadow and using black to describe a lot of pieces of that composition a lot more clearly and effectively. So one of the things I suggest doing, which is what I did with this piece, is before I add any ink at this stage, I just go in with some pencil and I sketch in where I want those shadows to be. The cool thing about drawing from your imagination is that you create the light source. So it's not like you're drawing something from life where you're beholden to the sun or the light source that you're working with. You can place the light source wherever you want. So at this stage, I sort of find or create the light source and figure out which part of the composition I want highlighted the most. And that's going to factor in how I organize the black across the page. So you can do it using pencil like this, or you can perhaps scan the piece and then print it out, and with a Sharpie, work on top of that printout, just so you could try different iterations. Or you could take a picture of the piece and sketch in where you want to put the blacks and the shadows in Photoshop. However you feel most comfortable, but I do recommend creating some sort of test run where you can try different iterations. So once I sketched in with pencil where I wanted the shadows to go, then I went in with the ink, and this is the most fun part for me because I get to do things like feathering, and I get to describe folds and drapery and render hair and add dramatic shadows to the figures. This is where, for me, the whole thing kind of comes to life. And because I wanted that Agent Carter character in the center to be the focus, I wanted her to be the lightest part of that whole composition. Therefore, the bad guy that she's punching, I put him in some pretty heavy shadows, because ultimately I want him and the Steve Rogers character in the background to be secondary to her. And so when it came time to inking her, I used the ink a little bit more sparingly, letting the line art underneath show through. Also, when it comes to balancing black and white in this way, it doesn't have to be so high contrast and stark. And in this case, I softened some of the lines on her skirt as well as some of the background shadow lines, just by using one of those smudge stick things that you use for charcoal drawings. Oftentimes I'll just use my finger, or sometimes I'll use a paper towel. Whatever I can do to soften the line a little bit in a certain area, I find that when I use it sparingly, it goes a really long way. You could also achieve that other tone by using stippling or cross-hatching. Some artists back in the day would use halftones. Strong black and white art doesn't always have to look like a Frank Miller Sin City piece. One of the things that I really love about artists like Alex Toth and a contemporary disciple of his like Chris Samnee is the way they utilize strong black and white art to describe things like background. So rather than finely detailing certain background elements, they kind of create these black and white shapes that very easily describe a window or a door or a street or a building, just with blocks of black and white. Now that's simple, but it's not easy, and it definitely takes time to master. I certainly have yet to master it myself, but I tried to utilize that technique in this commission by simplifying the background to very bold black and white shapes. That approach reads very clearly and fast, and I feel like for a commission or for a cover, for instance, approaching a background that way is most useful because you kind of want that fast read and you want something that's very aesthetically pleasing as well. This actually brings up another really interesting use of heavy black spotting versus a more clear line approach. And that is its contribution to pacing from a storytelling perspective. Depending on the type of scene or the type of story that you're telling, you may want a viewer or a reader to read something really fast or to read something a little slower. And I think that clean line approach helps to slow the reader down a little bit more, just because you're seeing more details and your eye is being exposed to more information. Whereas that more heavier black spotting approach, like an Alex Toth or a Frank Miller, it could kind of speed up the storytelling because it's a lot quicker and perhaps easier to digest. So there's so many elements that go into illustration and comic art, and you can utilize it from a strictly aesthetic perspective and design perspective, and you can also utilize those same elements from a narrative storytelling perspective as well. Ideally, blending those two together, I think, makes the strongest work. So this was a really fun commission to work on, and I'm glad I got to record enough of the process to make 2 different videos out of it, talking about 2 different topics. If you didn't see that last video I made, check that one out. It's all about erasing and utilizing the eraser to ultimately become a more confident, better artist. But I hope you guys dig this video as well, and I'm glad to have shared the completion of the process behind this particular commission. But I think that's all I got for now. If you have any questions about what I talked about in here, any comments, leave it down below. Like I say in a lot of my videos, I like to continue the conversation in the comments section. Oftentimes, a lot of you will share tips and ideas based upon the topic of the video that I didn't even think about. So that helps me as well, as I'm sure it helps some of you who are reading those comments. So let's really try and keep that comment section alive and help each other out with any kind of tips or suggestions that you might have. I think that's it now. I hope this made some sort of sense. I have another commission to get to work on now, actually, so I gotta go, but thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.